I found Voyage of the Chimera on Indiegogo. I was just looking at projects, seeing if there was anything interesting out there. I came across it. I thought the concept was really cool, both in terms of the story and the idea of making a sort of all-in-the-box show, which would allow like a smaller budget to cover a much greater scope. I thought that was really cool. And so I reached out and sort of said, here's what I do. Here's some of my music. Let me know if you guys are interested.
For the music, I knew I wanted something different than what's usual in a modern score. I didn't want just a textural score, and I didn't want something that was trying to hide, just trying to give sound to the soundtrack. I wanted a score that would really try and dig into the emotions and try and actually draw that stuff out.
More recently, there's been a lot more sort of atmospheric scoring. The sort of rhythm and pulse and feel and atmosphere has taken over. But I would say there are places where it's still very much around. It's definitely still out there, but it's now one of many options for how to score a film as opposed to the way that you score a film. This film score isn't necessarily wholly modern, but also not wholly traditional. Obviously, there's no one sound that is modern or even one sound that's traditional. And in this, we definitely took an approach that was more traditional in the sense that the music was much more present.
I wanted the music to help tell the story and not just disappear into the sound design.
Obviously, a lot of it uses a more traditional orchestral palette, but then on top of that, there's a fair amount of synthetic stuff and electronic stuff to sort of give it a little bit of an edge, a little bit of a bite to it. It's not a sort of romantic space opera. It's a character drama and needs that sort of edge and realism.
I'm a huge fan of film music, going all the way back to childhood, and so I have lots of different touch points and things I can talk about in terms of the ideas I have in mind for certain scenes. But ultimately, it's Martin who had to go off and actually write music, and what he brought to this movie is just astonishing.
In music circles and composing circles, there's this sort of age-old chicken and egg question of whether you come up with the harmony, which is the vertical stacking of notes, or the melody, the tune first. And a lot of people, particularly for film scoring stuff, where the harmony, which often gives the sort of raw, immediate emotional context, comes in, it is the most important thing for telling you what's happening in a scene. They'll start with a harmony and then come up with a tune that goes over it. And I've done that occasionally, but far more often for me, it's melody first. It's what is the scene telling me as a tune, or almost as a song. I have a background as a singer, and I'll sometimes literally hum along to a scene and see what jumps out at me.
Martin wrote a number of different themes, and the first one that he wrote was the opening fanfare. And that was really interesting because it's not your usual da-da-da, space opera kind of fanfare. There's a kind of muted heroism to it, but there's a largeness and an expansiveness to it.
There's a very large horn call that comes in, and that was conceived as the theme for the show. It's written in a way, it's not quite major and it's not quite minor. It's something in between, in order to, again, eschew the overly optimistic, the overly heroic, and instead give something that had a nobility, but also a sense of danger or suspense, or even just difficulty and challenge to the action in the film. There's a theme for the captain, Marcus, that is sort of thoughtful and slightly mysterious theme. He's not a heroic leader, and he's not some sort of abject failure. He's something in between. So the music had to try and walk that tightrope. He's conflicted, he's uncertain, but he's also in charge. And I think writing music that allowed him to be that and supported that character was important. There's a theme that appears that's intended to signify the ship that they're hunting, which is known as the White Ship. And where it shows up and where it doesn't show up is very important in the film. But it's intended to signify something that's sort of not just dangerous, but sort of awesomely dangerous, something that they're really not prepared to handle. The themes can really serve multiple purposes and give through lines to the story, so that the themes following characters or ideas or locations can then represent different action or motives or things like that in those locations. We were lucky enough to have Michael's wonderful sister Catherine singing for two cues. The opening cue, which is over the titles and establishes the tone of the film, and it's what she ended up singing in this beautiful sort of haunting soprano, is a theme that was intended to capture what ultimately would be the loneliness and the eeriness of the crew's adventures. In the same way, for a submarine film, you would want to capture the sort of claustrophobia and the depth of the sea. For this film, we wanted to capture the openness, but also the emptiness of space. When I got the final cut, I saw what a lengthy pilot it was, but also how much of it had yet to be digitally put into place. So what I was mostly looking at, in the same way the actors had to deal with it, was actors on a green screen with very few props, sitting at plastic tables holding coffee mugs, which eventually got turned into something that was sort of fantastically sophisticated and believable as an environment, as a ship. So I had to have Michael talk me through some of what was going on in some of the scenes and explain, oh, well, here this character motions this way, but they're actually pushing a button or flipping a switch or that kind of thing, and that causes this. And the sound effects, by and large, were not there as well.
We're rolling to port!
Hydra twin mount out of action!
Quad mount also out of action. Hydra 1.
There were points where engine noises were going to sort of envelop things, and I had to be aware of that. Obviously, in some of the battle sequences, there's a huge amount of score, as there always is in that kind of thing, which the music had to be able to sit around or get out of the way of. As I've heard actors describe it, it was like a big game of make-believe. There are things about the tone of a film which you get very much from the environment. So how dark or light the lighting is, whether the walls are pristine or sort of decaying, really informs a lot of the sort of subconscious emotional subtext of the film. So in that sense, it was somewhat more difficult to score everything on sort of brightly lit sets. On the other hand, I was able to have an image that was more immediately emotional or immediately the point of the scene. I wasn't being distracted by things that may or may not have been relevant. It was sort of like a stage play, writing music for a stage play, in that it was story and music with very little else in between. Threading the needle between character drama and sci-fi film was tricky, where to the point where Michael and I sometimes would even change what either or both of us would change our minds over the course of scoring a scene, that it was a little too dark, or then it wasn't dark enough.
It's funny because when we were talking about some of the action music, I was talking to Martin about repeated phrases, almost like a minimalist approach. I didn't think budget-wise we could do anything that was like fully orchestral action music. But Martin started sending me pieces of the opening action track, and I was listening to these going, listen to all these notes. This is a fully orchestrated piece of action music. There was no orchestra, with the exception of myself playing a tin whistle at one point, and singing some things and making some noises, and obviously Catherine singing at the beginning and the end. But those were the only live sounds. Everything else was what we call in the box or virtual instruments. These massive libraries of sampled sounds where they record each note one at a time, and then you can put them in whatever order you want, that I used to recreate an orchestra. We definitely pushed it to the limits of what samples can make sound good and sound convincing and sound real. There were certain orchestration decisions that I had to make to mitigate a little bit the "ooh, that doesn't sound real" effect that samples can sometimes have. But I think we managed to create something that by and large sounds
real enough that when you're watching the film and you're engrossed in the story, sounds like a traditional film score, and a traditional big film score, which is what we really wanted, while still ultimately being synthetic.
The way his music is able to reach down and draw the emotions to the surface and speak to the subtext and the things happening under the surface in some of these scenes, and the degree to which he's been able to render it realistically. I mean, it doesn't sound like a low-budget film score.
I was so in love with the orchestral sound and how well I felt it fit the larger scenes in this picture, that it was more specific to the film, that I thought the orchestra really captured the feel. A lot of the narrative things are very traditional, and the feel of it in some ways is sort of hearkening back to an older style of filmmaking. So I felt the orchestra fit really well. I like how eerie electronics can sound. With an orchestra, there's always a certain sense of familiarity. Even if you're not a composer or musician, you have heard a violin so many times in your life. You've heard a French horn so many times. But synths can sound like whatever you want them to sound, and you can get some sounds that are totally unidentifiable and therefore somewhat disconcerting, especially when you want to stay out of the way. Just the tone of a synth can really give you that level of eeriness, which I think works really well for not necessarily intimate things in the sense of like a romantic movie, but in something where it's ominous but also intimate. I think synths can serve the picture really well. It was an absolute blast in terms of being just a playground to try different musical ideas and to get to score something really, really fun, to just be on a project where everyone involved was so invested in it, in this sort of like when you were 8 years old, what you wanted your movie to be like and what you want your movie music to sound like and that kind of thing. It was really fun to work on that kind of project with other people who were invested in it the way Michael was and the way the whole cast and crew were.